This is a variable ND filter, and this is also a variable ND filter. This one only costs £28. This one costs nearly £250. Variable NDs are really important when it comes to shooting video, but should you spend almost 10 times the amount to buy this one over this one? Let's find out. This and this are the PolarPro and McKinnon variable ND filters version 2. And they come in two different strengths. This one is the 2 to 5 stop and this one is the 6 to 9 stop. So this one actually lets more light through than what this one does. And for one of these, you're looking at around about £250, or for both, obviously £500. In other words, a lot of money. If you're doing any kind of video work, especially outside, then I highly recommend that you have a variable ND filter. When you're inside, you can control the light a little bit better, and sometimes you need as much light as possible, so a variable ND filter isn't needed quite as much. But when you're outside and your shutter speed needs to be twice the frame rate, and you may also want a shallow depth of field, similar to this right here and how it's nicely blurred out, then the only thing you have to work with is your ISO. And if you're already at your base ISO like I am right now, if I didn't have a variable ND filter, this is what it would look like. The difference between a variable ND filter and a standard ND filter is literally what it says in the name, it's variable. So it literally means you can grab the ring and change the exposure of the shot without actually having to change the filter itself. That's one of the biggest perks of having a variable ND filter, but they do have the downsides as well. They come in a lot of different sizes. You can get them to match any of your lenses up to 82mm, and when we're talking sizes, I mean the filter thread and not the focal length. And they work pretty much the same way as to what this does. This is the Tide Optics variable ND filter, and it's ND2 to ND400, or if you're talking about stops, it's around about 1 stop to around about 8.6 stops. But for the sake of this video, we'll say 1 to 9 stops, making this very similar to what both of these PolarPro filters can do together. And how one of these costs a whole £250, one of these only costs you £28, meaning you could buy 17 of these for the price of one of these and still have a little bit of change left over in your pocket. So obviously from that makes these completely redundant, and you should buy one of these, right? You'd think so, but there are things that the PolarPro has that the Tide Optics doesn't. For instance, the PolarPro ones have clear markings for each stop, so at 2 stops, 3 stops, 4 stops, and so on, you can clearly see when you hit one of them stops. They also have this haptic feedback, so when you get to a certain stop, you can feel the click and you know you've reached, let's say, 3 stops or 4 stops, and you don't actually have to look. But if I'm honest, none of that really matters because I don't care about how it actually feels, and I don't actually care what stop I'm at. It's more about just how the overall image looks. But that's just my opinion. You may think slightly different, and it's for you to decide whether you would actually benefit from that. So the Tide Optics, like many other budget filters, doesn't have that. It just displays a minimum and maximum mark with an arrow to go alongside it, and once you go past the maximum mark, the filter will just continuously spin all the way around till it hits the minimum mark. So does that mean it gets darker than ND400, or in our case 9 stops? No, it actually just gets lighter after the maximum mark all the way through to the minimum mark once again. But before it does any of that, it displays a horrible black X across the whole center of the image, making the whole image unusable. Whereas the PolarPro one doesn't display the black X, and that's probably why it's split across 2 filters rather than just a single one. On the Tide Optics filter, the X does start to creep in after around about 50 to 60% strength, and at first you see it in the corner, so you see it in the top right and the bottom left. The image isn't entirely unusable, but it does degrade the image slightly in comparison to the PolarPro one, which doesn't really darken in the corners quite as much. When it comes to variable NDs or filters in general that you have to put onto the front of the lens, you do have to take into consideration any kind of vignetting that you may get. Both of these filters are fairly low profile, so you should get minimal, if any, vignetting in any of your image. When I'm shooting at 24mm on either of these, I get no vignetting, but when I use 16mm, I do get some vignetting. That's because I use a UV filter behind that to protect the lens, and by using a UV filter as well as a variable ND filter, it's just bringing that filter away from the front element a little bit more, creating the vignette. But if I did take the UV filter off, you won't get any vignetting, but I'm just a lazy photographer and videographer, so the UV filter stays on for me. The biggest difference between these two filters is the color cast each one generates. Both of them give you a slight color shift, but the Tide Optics is slightly warmer than what the PolarPro one is. You can obviously color correct this in Premiere or any kind of video editing software that you're using, but ideally you should be setting the white balance after you put the filter on and not before. But regardless of whichever way you do the workflow, it is still really easy to correct. Other notes to point out is that the Tide Optics filters, very similar to other budget filters that I've used in the past, is delivered in just this simple white case. Whereas the PolarPro filters come in this really nice Defender case. But does it really add anything to the filter as a filter itself? No, not really, but it is a really nice added extra, and for the price of the PolarPro ones, you would expect that. Overall, I think that the Tide Optics variable ND filter, like many other budget variable ND filters, is a great filter for the price in comparison to the PolarPro. It does have its downfalls like I've mentioned, but if you just need a variable ND filter to do some video work, which isn't going to break the bank, it's certainly a good option. I personally never used the 6 to 9 stop PolarPro variable ND filter, so when it comes to getting the X across the Tide Optics one, I don't think I'd actually ever get to that stage where I get that. So therefore the budget variable ND filter would probably do me for maybe 80 to 90% of the work I do. It's just sometimes on them really sunny days, sometimes you just need that extra stop. And in them situations, if I'm honest, I just like to change the aperture on the camera rather than having to unscrew a filter to then get another one out to put it on, maybe just for 1 or 2 shots. Like I said, I'm a bit lazy at times. Don't judge me. But on the flip side of the coin, do I still rate the PolarPro variable ND filters? Absolutely. They're incredibly well built, they feel amazing to work with. The colour you get from them is really great, and as long as you have the cash to buy either or both, you won't be disappointed with your purchase. As for which of the 2 filters you should buy, whether it's budget or expensive, only you can decide that. This video hasn't been sponsored in any way by Tide Optics or PolarPro. I've done this because I was just really interested to find out what the difference is between the variable ND filters, and hopefully it's helped you out too. So with that, there's only one thing left to do, and that is the results. So what do we think? Do we think budget A was the cheaper, more budget friendly variable ND filter, or was it option B? And in 3, 2, 1, the results are option A was the more budget friendly Tide Optics variable ND filter, and option B was the PolarPro Peter McKinnon 2 to 5 stop ND filter. Did you get it right? And if so, which one did you prefer? Let me know down in the comment section below. As always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then hit the like button. If you want to see more content like this and more comparisons, more video content, then hit the subscribe button. And if you do, I'll see you right there. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great week.